How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the second to last week, penultimate, if you will, week of the semester. We're almost there. We're almost in 2025, where history starts to pass the baton to other disciplines like political science and sociology, things that can be a little more um, have their finger on the pulse a little bit. History, as we've sort of seen, is more of a broad scope. But hopefully, I mean, the whole point of ideally of this class, right, is that you will be able to look around the sort of modern landscape a little bit and understand historical trends that brought us to the present. Right? And that's really what, hopefully, especially 152 is meant to do. Right? What if you look at a headline, have a better idea of where that is in the world, what some of the history is behind that, what causes led to these effects, right, that are happening now, and what is now an effect will soon be a cause for something in the future. History is not predictive. We don't know where things are going, but we can kind of utilize our knowledge of the past to shape how we approach the present and then hopefully shape the future. So, yeah, and this class, I mean, this week we're sort of looking at this idea of globalization, this sort of post Cold War world, where there's very much a movement to this bipolar world's collapse, and you see this really rapid in the 90s, early 2000s, a lot of the globalization that these national organizations, the EU, NAFTA nations being like, we need these new alliances to be made in this post Cold War world. You see a lot of NGOs as well, non-governmental organizations that sort of straddle outside of this nation-based. Again, we talk nations are a construct. These non-NGOs are transnational. They work with nations, but they're independent of them. So I gave you that example of Live Aid and Freddie Mercury. One, because it's a great song and a great moment, but that Live Aid 1985, though it was a little bit before the end of the Cold War, it was this shift, this idea that it was the whole point of Live Aid was to give aid to the famine in Ethiopia, that the Ethiopian nation state was not addressing the needs of its people. So other non-governmental organizations could come in and help, and people on a global scale could help with localized problems. And also Freddie Mercury is a really interesting sort of global figure. His parents were originally Farsis from India who lived in Zanzibar, part of the British Empire. They moved then to London, so you have this imperial world there. And then Freddie Mercury himself, right? He had contracted AIDS in the beginning of his the AIDS outbreak and issues of that, and obviously the right of LGBTQ rights and things. So this 1980s was a very dynamic movement, and then you see that played out on a global scale. So you have on one hand this globalization, but then you have this other hand of people who are resistant to this, particularly sort of this Americanization or corporatization of the world. So you see a little pushback of globalization. Somewhat like 9/11 is sort of seen as the moment where kind of a turning point in contemporary history, that and the progressive war on terror, where you see this new configuration of alliances and wars and conflicts. Again, not as grand scale as the world wars of the 20th century, but still within there. And then and then with 2008 and the economic downturn, a lot of people wanted to move away from this globalization. You see that, and that's still kind of working its way out today. Or sort of the pendulum, Cold War swing to globalization. It's swung back to sort of anti-globalization, Brexit, MAGA movements. If you look at like a lot of sort of more sort of nation first prioritized. You see that in a lot of areas. China with Xi Jinping and a lot of different worlds. It's sort of this. Let's worry about us and not worry so much about the rest of the world. How that works out on a grand stage, I guess we'll see. We don't really know. We're kind of living in it right now. And again, that was sort of the second part of the lecture 2, kind of lay the land of contemporary, as much as I can. It's always changing. So even some of the things I talked about in that lecture have changed since then. But I tried to kind of get broad scope of what's going on, this sort of decolonization, nation building in the 21st century in sort of places around the world: China, the Silk Road, South Asia, India, and Pakistan. Hopefully, know a little bit more about the partition there now. Um, Africa, right? And sort of, I gave two examples, like some nations in Africa, the ones you never hear about, they're doing relatively well. They've formed a nation. They're economically prosperous. They're stable. Ellen Jackson Sharif, that I gave a video of. She was president of Liberia. I gave a talk. She talks about the challenges Liberia's face, but they're coming out of there. Namibia, right? All these nations that you don't really hear about too much in Africa. That's because they're doing pretty well. They've transitioned. And then there's, on the other hand, you have nations that are still struggling with this sort of nation building process, which now is very difficult. It's not easy. You have this issue of this colonial legacy. Some groups were prioritized, some weren't. You see that in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus, and the issues that there. Sometimes, like, as a colonial power left, one person or a group of people took over power, became a dictator, an autocrat, and then kind of assumed the power there. And a lot of them stayed in power over time. Some that were more liberal minded, wanted more democracies, they were assassinated. So again, I try to give sort of a lay of the land of Africa as well. So, it's complicated. Latin America as well is kind of see. Hopefully, you have a better idea of how these areas got to where they are today. So, and then just, so that's kind of the lectures, and then sort of some points here. If you want to revise your product paper, you still have that opportunity. I put the product paper protocols up on the student resources. You can follow those. You have until the last day of the semester to get those back to me, which I think is Friday, December 12th. If you have given me a revision one, I have it. I apologize. It's been on my to-do list. This week, I'm going to clear the plate of all of those assignments that you've sent me that I need to get back to you. That's this week's project. I will get done with that. So, but if you want to revise your product paper, you definitely can. And then the last part here, the discussion post for this week, it's very much more reflective. Just kind of, we talked about the Ka'au framework, and this hua ka'i, right? That's seed. The why are you here? That this course is, and if this semester at Hawaii Community College is it, this area, this chapter in your book, right? Of your life. So what did you get from it? The sort of last phase of this, after the hoina, the finishing, we're almost done, is the haina, right? The declaration, the proclamation, what have you learned from this journey, right? What were some high points? What were some low points? But really in the context of a class, like, what is it? What is there something from this class you're like, that was interesting, I never knew, or I kind of knew about it, and now it's a little more clear. And then the other side of that, right, is, now you have some knowledge. Like, what are you going to share? What knowledge are you going to take from this class to others, right? I mean, what use is knowledge if we just kind of like put it in and move on, right? Then if somebody asks you, you took that 152 class, like, what did you learn? Or maybe somebody says something about some place in the world, like, I learned a little bit about this. So that's kind of the whole point of this course, world history course. Get a broad sense of things. So with this Ka'au framework discussion post, what is it? What is things that what's something you may be taking about and can spread beyond? So I think that's it. Have a good rest of your week.